Whether you've got 10 listeners or 10,000 listeners, to those listeners, what you say matters.
Because this is clearly going to be noteworthy.
From your lips to God's ears. Do I co-own this episode of your show?
I'll sign whatever you put in front of me.
Do it fast. Right here on the Anycast. Make it strong, make it last. Right here on the Anycast.
All right, I'm here today with, I believe, the podcast lawyer. I don't know if that's a trademark or not, but certainly that's what I've been told. The one, the only, Gordon Firemark. How are you?
Hey, Matt. Thanks. Glad to be here. Yeah, I think it's a trademark. I think I'm. Okay. I also believe I'm the trademark, the podcast lawyer. Excuse me. But it is not a registered trademark. It's my brand, and I'm working on it.
So the non-circle T, just the TMT.
Only because there's, it's a descriptive term, so it needs to accumulate enough secondary meaning, and I think I'm there. I've got to get it done.
I mean, I just did my part, I hope. So there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matt.
So for those who might not know you, other than that amazing moniker, 2 minutes or less, where did you come from? Where are you now? Where did you come from? And what are you here to plug? And then in 2 minutes, people can fast forward and skip over all that and get to the good stuff.
I love that. So Gordon Firemark is the name. I'm an entertainment lawyer here in Los Angeles, California. I've been practicing law for 32 and change years. In the last 10 or so, I've become known as the podcast lawyer, and that's largely because I am also a podcaster. And when I started, I set about to do the due diligence and make sure I was doing things right. That led to writing the book on the subject called The Podcast Blog and New Media Producers Legal Survival Guide. Folks can find that at podcastlawbook.com. And I love helping creators, and the creator economy itself is fascinating and interesting and fun to work in. Came out of a radio and television production background before law school, and I just love working with the creative folks. So that's who I am.
Awesome. Did you always want to get in front of the camera?
No. What's interesting is until I started podcasting, I thought of myself as a behind-the-scenes guy. I was the sound technician in the live theater stuff that I used to do, working behind the scenes in film and TV and radio, and then needed to start marketing my law practice. So I started a blog, and that evolved into a podcast pretty much as soon as the technology made itself available.
Interesting. I'm always fascinated into how people made the jump to podcaster. So there was a day, there's always a line. There was a day where you were not a podcaster, and then the next day you were a podcaster. How did you get to the point of crossing that threshold?
Well, it's interesting. I was an early adopter as a listener. I was following Leo Laporte when they changed up the format of Tech TV and it became G4 TV or something. And he created his show, his original show, Twit. And I was following. I thought, oh, that's really cool. And then right around the same time, this fellow who had a podcast for videographers reached out to me and asked me to be a guest. And I would say the day I did that, that's probably 2006 or so, going on as a guest. And that evolved into being a regular on the show every few weeks. And then when he got accused by his boss of moonlighting and told to stop podcasting, I was bitten by the bug. So I started my show.
Yep.
And Entertainment Law Update launched in early 2009. So been at it a long time.
So 2009 to today, obviously a multitude of things have changed in the world, but podcast landscape specifically, how do you see sort of that? I mean, obviously there's been a ton of growth, but if you had to characterize the change in the last, say, is that 15 years? What has that been?
Interestingly, I would say the biggest change, the most important change for both new podcasters and those of us who've been at it a while is the playing field has gotten more and more level over time. It's just the technology's gotten easier to navigate. The computers and the bandwidth and all those things have gotten much better. And so I would say it's easier now to start a podcast than it ever has been. And that makes for a multitude of voices with the opportunity to have some impact that really never existed until 20 years ago. And even in the last 15 is really just, it's just booming now. I would say anybody who has something to say can find a way to get it out there.
Yeah.
So that's the promise, I guess you could call it, of podcasting. As far as the changes, It started out as a grassroots bunch of individuals, independent people doing their thing, again, just to get their message out. It's become more corporatized, I guess you could say, and there have been the bigger shows that tend to have the big platforms behind them, and oftentimes they're big mainly because there's a big name host on the front end of the show. And with that, the commercial motivation of things has shifted a bit, and people are thinking about monetization of what, for a lot of us, and when we started, was more of a hobby or a sideways entry into monetization. Like, for me, it's about promoting myself as a brand and building my business as a lawyer and my products and services.
Sure.
I don't sell ads on the show in order to make a living from it. But yeah, so I'd say that's a misconception so many podcasters have, is that you make money from the podcast. No, you make money because you have the podcast and it attracts attention for other things. I heard Paul Colligan saying similar things on your show a week or two ago. So.
Yeah, lifetime value of a customer is the metric that probably most people need to keep track of, right?
And so many people are not thinking about it that way. So
yeah. Going back to, obviously you have a lot of background in podcasting, and I'm sure we'll get back to podcasting specifically, but I have to get more into the lawyery side of things, just because you're such a unique species in that regard. Is there anybody else in the world right now that if you walked into them, they would go, I'm a podcast lawyer?
I think there are 2 or 3 of us.
Okay.
Yeah, we tend to be on panels together and friendly, and there's camaraderie there.
How does remind me? You said did you do a specialization in entertainment law originally, or how did you get to entertainment law?
Well, because I came out of radio and TV and film as a college major, and I worked in the television business briefly before the writers went on strike in the late 80s. That was my motivation to go to law school. So I started law school really with an eye toward working in the entertainment industry from the get-go. Now, there is no such thing as a specialization per se in this field, but you take the elective classes in law. Everybody studies contracts and property and torts and things like that, and wills and trusts. So you take the courses on copyrights and trademarks and entertainment industry business practices and those kinds of things, and you become an entertainment attorney. So really, that's the nature of entertainment law, is that it's this amalgamation of various aspects of both personal and business legal principles against a backdrop of a really peculiar business.
Right.
And peculiar clients, to be really honest.
Yeah.
In a good way. So I guess you could say I focused my energy from the very beginning on being in the field of entertainment.
And if you fast forward from then to today, could you have foreseen sort of what's happened with the internet and podcasting specifically, but like, how different is the future than the one you might have envisioned when you were first finishing law school as far as what you're practicing?
When I finished law school, I thought I would be working at a movie studio doing business and legal affairs, wearing the fancy suits, driving the fancy car, and being, that sexy image we all had from the TV show LA Law back then.
That sounds terrible.
To think about it now, it does. It really does. I'm so fortunate that I get to. You're looking at me. I'm in my home office or my man cave, if you want, and to be able to do the kind of work that I do with the people I do. I pick and choose who my clients are. It's really, really cool. But as far as the technology and the world of media, from then to now, I don't think I foresaw that this level playing field would exist. I assumed that there would always be the need for expensive equipment and dedicated studio spaces and things like that. And so, like I said, it's just gotten so easy for everybody to be a content creator.
Sure.
And that, I would say, is where the legal risk comes in, is that so many folks who are coming in to make a show, a podcast or a YouTube channel or whatever, have no training in media production, media business, journalism, those kinds of things. And that's where the risk lies, is just sort of not knowing what the rules and the boundaries are. And so they're breaking them in ways that, look, breaking rules isn't a bad thing necessarily, but you have to know what they are before you break them so you can tailor the experience for folks.
Sure. One of the things we've talked about with a few people this year is the contrast between, say, being on radio and starting your own podcast. And the difference is when you're on radio, you're just the talent. And like you come in and you record and you're done. And there's an apparatus that wraps everything around you. And normally what we talk about in that apparatus, or what we've been talking about, is there's an audio engineer, there's production, there's, a producer booking guests and stuff like that. But behind the scenes, there's also, if not a large one, a small army of lawyers, accountants, people running the back end of the business that, again, as the quote unquote talent, not your concern, nothing you'd have to really think about.
Yeah.
What is the worst way you can think of somebody realizing that, like, oh, oops, yeah, that is something that I wish I knew that I should have been doing that? Like, what's the worst case scenario for somebody?
Well, I mean, the worst case scenario is that you say or do something that causes a tremendous damage to someone else's reputation, or and that, defamation kind of a claim, or you say something on your show and somebody relies on it and then goes out and ends up dead. I'd say that's the worst scenario.
Right. So you find out because you get served with some sort of notice that thing that you did has caused somebody
a cease and desist letter or a lawsuit or something like that. And then, look, there's lots of things that we sort of do think about, right? I mean, I don't think anybody needs to be warned that you might hear about it from a copyright point of view if you use a piece of music in your show without licensing. It's funny, you were talking about the difference between people who were just the talent and those of us that have to sort of wear more hats and be more immersed in things. The call I was on just before we joined this call, I was talking to a guy who had been on television news for 30 years. And he, to his credit, he was calling me because he said, I don't know what to do about the music I want to use on my show, and what can I do? And then we had a long conversation, and I think I got him pointed in the right direction. But, there are lots of these hurdles that he knew to ask the questions, but a lot of folks don't. And
well, he's probably had standards and practices coming at him for 30 years.
Well, and when you're in news, you don't worry so much about copyright because most of it, newsworthy subject matter, if you need to bring a piece of music in, it's because it's fair use. And, and that's one of those buzzwords. That's the other big mistake that so many podcasters make, is assuming what they're doing is fair use when it really probably isn't.
I could see that being the number one mistake for sure. What is the right process? Like, say somebody doesn't have a relationship with you in particular, or has an attorney that they're connected with, and they're going, I've got some content, video, audio, whatever it is. I want to use it on my podcast. I've got 100 listeners. I can't afford to go pay. I can't afford any attorney's fees of any kind to talk about anything for this show. What's like the mental checklist people should be going through, or is it just don't even bother? If you have the question, don't even bother.
I would say it doesn't have to be a mental checklist. There's a book by this guy named Gordon who wrote this
podcast attorney
for podcasters.
Yes,
the podcast blog and new media producers, legal survival. It's at podcastlawbook.com.
Yes,
and it talks about this stuff.
Okay,
but the bottom line, the rule really is, if you're using something made by somebody else in the last century, 95 years technically, you should assume that it's protected under copyright law, which means that only the owner or author of that work has the right to make copies, distribute copies, display or perform the thing, and make derivatives of it. That's copyright law in a nutshell. So you need permission from them. The fair use thing I was mentioning is a First Amendment adjustment or exception defense to copyright infringement that says, hey, what I'm doing is valuable to us as a society, and therefore I'm asking you, judge and jury, to rule that my infringement was justified because of the First Amendment free speech. And so usually it's for educational purposes or newsworthiness and stuff like that. You've only used a small snippet. It's not a substitute for the experience of consuming the original work. Those kinds of complicated 4-factor analysis that has to be gone through. And that's really the reason I say don't rely on that, because if you can't afford to pay for a license, you certainly can't afford the lawyers to do that analysis for you.
Sure. And then and I'm sure this is covered in the book. And so if anybody does have real questions, this is me just sort of scratching the surface here. Please. Number one, I am not a lawyer. Gordon is, but he would tell you just go consult a lawyer, and before that, check out the book, get yourself educated. As a podcaster, you yourself are creating copyrighted material. So it's not like the machinery only works in one direction. And probably on balance, the machinery favors podcasters more than your average bear because, hey, you're out here, you're creating works. You've got opportunities to either license that or make sure people aren't using it. As somebody who now has copyright rights, what is the same thing? What's like the first thing you should be thinking about as a podcaster that now that you're actually creating works that are going out into the world from that standpoint?
That's a great question. The good news is for creators, you don't have to do anything to acquire a copyright and that bundle of rights that I was describing. The mere act of making the thing, making the work, fixing the expression, it has to be original expression, but fixing that original material in some tangible form, like a recording, you own a copyright from the moment it springs into existence right then, and it continues for your life plus 70 years. So that means that your children and grandchildren can reap the benefits of it if there's a market for it. So there really isn't that much to do from that standpoint other than be on the lookout for when those rights are being infringed and on the lookout for opportunities to do something with that content that you're making. We're building this typically pretty big content library of property. And if you can find ways to turn that into revenue, that's a good thing.
Yeah. I imagine that the biggest challenge that somebody's going to have to face in this regard is probably when they have your average podcaster has something resembling a high profile guest, where now people are going to be like, oh, this, like, you got to see what so-and-so said on this show. And now that's when now you might have the feeling like, oh my God, this was my show. Why are people allowed to use that clip? And now we're back into the
clips from me talking on your show end up on other people's YouTube channels.
Absolutely.
Like that.
As they will, because this is clearly going to be noteworthy and yes.
From your lips to God's ears. Yes. But yeah, I mean, and that's a situation where we do have to think about that fair use, because it's one thing if someone wants to just repost your content and say, hey, look at this great stuff, watch it over here instead of over on Matt's channel, right? That's not okay. If they're doing it because listen to what this idiot Gordon said about XYZ and let me correct the record, or, this is why he should never be allowed to run for office or whatever. Now we're getting into that newsy area where it might be a fair use, especially if they're only playing a few seconds as a clip.
Right.
So that's this sort of balancing act that we have to engage in when we start to use other people's stuff and when we see our own stuff being used. You have to, before you do that DMCA takedown or cease and desist letter, you need to do some analysis and think through, hey, wait a minute, is there maybe some reason it's okay for what they just did?
Sure. Yeah, and also, I would never turn down free publicity.
Well, there's that, and a lot of podcasters do feel that way. Another thing is maybe you look on those situations as an opportunity to open a conversation about doing some kind of a collab or having them on a guest as a guest on your show or vice versa.
Yeah.
So they're getting it straight from the horse's mouth rather than secondhand.
Sure. Zooming out a tiny bit, one of the things that strikes me about where podcasting has started to go, and just new media in general, is, we were sort of like, there's this old model where you have these big, powerful conglomerates, be they the movie studios or the record labels, and the artist tends to be on the wrong side of the power imbalance, shall we say. And
at the beginning,
yeah. And then we have this big independent wave of podcast movement, like everybody can be a creator, and we level the playing field, as you said. And now we're kind of going to this place where there's these larger companies coming in, buying up podcasts. Is this going to look the same in 10 to 15 years? Is there going to be a power imbalance and a lack of independence again? Or do you see the technology being able to sort of power through that?
I think the answer is both. I think that it will not look the same, but that increasing power in the hands of those with the resources is going to continue. But because it's a level playing field, because we individuals can sort of manage the technology and the relatively small expense of making and distributing content, there will always be the independent voices That's, sort of true as any new technology has come in. It was expensive to own a printing press, but technically anybody could have done it. And it's same as with a radio or television. You had to get a license, but here, by the leveling of the playing field I'm talking about, is we've taken out all that intermediation and given us the opportunity with an internet connection and a laptop and a camera and a microphone to get it out there. And that's not going to go away just because 5 big companies own most of the whatever it is they own 10, 20 years from now. That said, I wonder if, given the challenges of making real money from this kind of a thing, and let's face it, only a handful of podcasts are really generating big dollars because that's what the audiences are really interested in. Mm-hmm. I think that's not changing anytime soon either. It's really hard, as record labels have known for years, to break a new artist. It's really hard to break in if you're not a name that people recognize or you have some other distinctive brand. I mean, we've seen a few people who are kind of suddenly famous and they, of course, launch a podcast, do this, do that, get your YouTube up and going quickly to capitalize on that 15 minutes of fame. But I wouldn't be surprised to see some of these bigger companies that are buying up podcasts to start to realize, well, maybe it's not as shiny as we thought it was.
Sure. And I guess it's different today too, because today those big companies, nobody's breaking a new podcast, right? They're going to what's existing. They're going to somebody who says, "Oh, you already have 100 million fans that you're already monetizing."
Yeah.
Okay, let's get involved in the economics of that.
Right. And there are a few who are really investing in building a new show because they think they sense they've got a good, they know the pulse of the audience and they can do it. Mm-hmm. And that's where having big resources can really make a difference, because you do have to engage in a lot of promotion to break something new. But it has to be something people really, really want.
Related to that, how do you see 2009, pretty easy to get your podcast. Even 2009 wasn't that easy, but it was, there was not 4.5 million podcasts you were competing against.
Yeah.
If it was easier to get some notability, even with not your audience, right? Just in general, people would find it because it's like, oh, I'm clicking around. There's only so many under legal. There's only so many, right. like it was a pretty small directory.
Well, true. I don't really think of it as being in competition with that the rest of those 4.5 million. Mm-hmm. I really think of it as narrow casting. I've got a message that I know only appeals to a small segment of the audience, and really in that particular space, it isn't that hard to stand out. Now, if I was doing a comedy show or I don't know, pick a topic that's more popular, then yeah, there is a broader audience. But even so, everybody's unique voice brings something new to the party. And if you can distinguish yourself as creating great quality, but also, the stuff that our audience really cares about, you can attract that audience. My first show, the main one that I was talking about, is Entertainment Law Update. And it is exactly what it sounds like. My co-host and I do a monthly news roundup of cases that have come up in the entertainment law world. Well, there's only 2,000 or 3,000 people in the whole world who are going to care about that enough to tune in every month. And so I look at that as that's my market. And if I can get 2,000 people to listen to my show every month in the podcast world, that's actually still considered in the probably the top 10, maybe top 5% of all podcasts.
Yeah.
Which is telling, by the way. But I consider that really good success in a niche topic show. Mm-hmm. And when I have sold ads, the advertisers have agreed that I'm reaching a particular audience. We know exactly who we're talking to, and that's worth something to them.
Yeah.
Better than the average value of a podcast ad. So I think that's the key, is to, distinguish and niche down and just be really good in your space.
Yeah.
And of course, do what you can to promote and market and be visible.
It seems to be common advice that we've heard a lot this season is just, you got to really know your audience, and then you can't figure out who you're speaking to unless you have an idea, right? It's like, I think the person I want to reach is X. Okay, what would be Y is what would be interesting to person X. How do I now go out and do a show about Y that would appeal to X? It sounds easier in a math formula than probably in practice it is for most people.
And at the launch stages, you may not know who your audience is because you haven't attracted them yet, right? So sometimes it's about guessing to a certain extent. I want to make a show that feeds my needs as a creator. So you work at it backwards. You look, all businesses are about solving a problem for someone, for the customers.
Yep.
And the question is, what's a problem that enough customers have that I can solve with what I'm going to do?
Right.
And that's true of a podcast. It's true of making a better mousetrap, whatever it is. So if you don't know who your audience is, well, then you start to look at, well, what am I good at? What problems can I solve? And then you go looking who has that problem.
Right.
And ask the question, is that enough of an audience to be worth doing?
Do you remember when it sounds like when you started your first podcast, it was literally just about, I kind of am hooked and I've lost my venue, so I'm going to create a new venue? Or was there more to that? Did you have a bigger vision when you first started?
Well, what it was I was already using a blog about these cases and things like that as a way of marketing my practice. It's a blog, and it would go out originally as a hard copy newsletter to my leads list. And so that was how I was marketing myself as a lawyer. Remind people of what kind of an expert I am and what I think about and what I'm doing and those kinds of things, and then answer their questions when they came in, and some percentage of that turns into business. So when podcasting came along, I saw it as this is easier than writing a blog every day. Do this once a week or once a month, and I've got my content, and then I can just send out the newsletter that says, hey, look at what I made last week. And so that was my thinking behind it. My vision was never, I'm going to become a star in the podcasting world or whatever. It was just about, let me get the word out so people remember me when it's time to hire a lawyer who does what I do.
Right. So you already had an idea because of the newsletter and the blog about who your audience was.
It was an adaptation of my marketing channel.
Yeah,
I guess you would say.
So for people who have a business that are, for whatever reason, are now taking the opportunity to consider podcasting, what would you say to your average business owner, let's say who's not particularly technical, but has a team and, has been pitched, hey, you should really do podcasting. Yeah, we kind of, but man, it's hard. How do you coach people through that?
I think what I would say to that average, look, it's going to depend on the kind of business, of course. If your business gets most of its customers online through social media and things like that, this is going to be a great way to make content that's valuable to them, that solves their problem, that keeps them interested. And if you're running a brick and mortar hardware store, I don't know that it really is the right choice.
Right.
Although maybe you do something that's very local in nature, so you're reaching your people.
Sure.
But ultimately, I think it comes down to knowing what problems you solve and making sure that your podcast content is in alignment with your customers. Again, know who your ideal audience avatar is.
Right.
Are they your customers? Are they your referral sources? I talk to other lawyers a lot about, should I start a podcast? And I ask, well, what kind of a lawyer are you? Well, I do motorcycle accident cases. And I say, well, listen, you got to find an angle because people aren't tuning into a podcast about motorcycle accidents.
Right. Or are
until they have a motorcycle accident, right? So, but maybe you do a show about motorcycle touring or motorcycle equipment where that you're attracting a lot of people who are interested in motorcycles, so that when one of them has that inevitable accident, your name is first off their lips. That's sort of that approach.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah. I think that helps. One of the, I don't know who the algorithm on YouTube thinks I am, but one of the thing that keeps coming up on my feed that the first time I saw it, I was like, this is genius. And now I've seen like a couple of riffs on it, but it's the, I don't know who the original was, so I don't want to name anybody in particular because I don't know who copied who. But there's a series of landscapers who go out and clean up people's really messy yard cleanup for free. And then I just saw another take on it of people who go replace people's roofs or eaves or whatever, and they're a roofing company. And on one hand, the moment I saw it, I was like, this is genius. Because especially the first channel I saw, I'm like, he doesn't even need referrals. This video has 74 million views. Right. Like, you're no longer even in the landscaping business. You're now a media company.
Yeah.
But especially with you here, I was like, there's a lot of ways this could probably go wrong. I went to somebody's house, nobody answered the door, so then I went and did their yard work for them. Like, every time I watch it, I'm just like, thank God nobody's getting injured in any of these. Right. It's like my first thing. Because I don't know whether, your insurance policy covers volunteerism. Like, it's a very odd thing that you're doing outside of the world of social media. Like, it's business, but you're also volunteering. But it's also promotional, but you're also not.
I would think that the angle on it, if you ever have to make an insurance claim, is, well, it's a marketing thing.
Sure.
So it's part of my business. But yeah, I think that, I think I watch a few of the same things, and I think they do generally try to get permission. I don't know. They
do. I've seen a few where it's just like nobody came to the door. We came back a week later. There was still nobody there. We figured.
And at some point, it's, let's clean it up so the neighbors are happy about it. And those kind of things. Yeah.
And I don't know if there's a scene that's edited out where somebody signs a release, and like it's not exactly one single cut that we watch. So
right. There are risks, and I think every business. I mean, the good news is the guy who cleans up yards, he ought to know what the risks are of that kind of work. Mm. And don't work when there are kids around, and whatever, and don't damage the plumbing and the sprinkler system and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I imagine that there are occasions where he makes a video and then decides I better not run it because the homeowner wasn't happy or whatever.
Yeah.
And I would say every business is going to have those kinds of things that only the expert in that field is really going to be aware of.
Yeah.
So it's about using common sense.
I just thought it was such a good mix of things outside the box. Found, like, what else are you gonna, like, if you're a landscape business, how else are you gonna, like, this is me interviewing other people. Like, there's only so much interest you can get, and then there's this whole genre that getting like hundreds of millions of views.
It's amazing. Yeah. And the quality of those videos isn't even that good.
No, right.
No offense to those creators. It's about the work, not about the video.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I when you think about privacy and you think about what YouTube and Google know about us, and they're feeding you that video and they're feeding it to me too. And I don't know about you, but I also see videos of pretty girls, videos of Chinese food cooking, and what's the other one? Oh, the hoof guys, the guys who clean horse hoofs and trim. Yeah, I was like, why would they think I'm interested? And because I sit there watching them.
Yes, that's it.
It's a little scary.
Yeah, I don't know if the algorithm, like, we're talking to a lot of people who have a radio background, and I always remember, and I never knew if it was true. I assume it wasn't, but I remember when Howard Stern came to Canada when I was in high school, and it was like people who love Howard Stern listen for 30 minutes, and people who hate Howard Stern listen for 90 minutes.
Oh, that's interesting.
And like, I don't know how much of my YouTube viewing is that too. Like, this is stupid. There's no way he can keep.
Yeah.
Like, I hate this. I'm going to keep watching to see what I hate next.
Right.
And then
it's funny.
Yeah.
It's the train wreck mentality, right?
That's it. Well, and I guess some of it today is there has to be some percentage of stuff that's like, let me show you stuff that generates an angry reaction from you.
Yeah. I mean, it's all about producing those hormones, dopamine and whatever the counter to that is. And keeping, let's face it, these platforms now are in the business of keeping people on the platform. Mm. I'll say, since we're talking about podcasting, I want to point out that that's a major contrast between the YouTube, and even Spotify is in the business of keeping people on their platform. But if you're an independent podcaster or even a corporate podcaster, it's sort of one and done. People come and they listen to the piece of content that their favorite creator put out this week, and then they're on to the next thing in their life. Mm. Whereas, so that's maybe something that the business model will need to address. And I do think that discoverability of new shows and finding the next thing, that's where and why YouTube is doing so well in the podcast space, frankly, is, oh, you like a podcast about this topic, let's give you 12 more things that we think you'll like too.
Sure. Yeah, and
RSS doesn't do that.
No, and maybe if it had tried to, we wouldn't be here either. right? Like some of the what got us to this point is the idea that it wasn't trying to do that. It didn't have as many tentacles that it was trying to hook into you. And now it's I think it has a lot more to do with YouTube going, there's a lot of people listening to podcasts, which means they're not watching us.
Yeah, that's true.
And that is directly related to something that, my original mental model when I first heard about podcasting in 04, 05 was like, oh, this competes with radio. Right? That was just like the mental, like, oh, I would listen to this instead of listening to the radio. And that might have been true when it was the iPod and you're going to download it the night before. And, it was a slightly different model. Today, it's podcasting just competes for attention.
Yeah.
It's not, it's as much competing with YouTube as it is competing with Netflix, as it is competing with driving to the store. Well, maybe not driving to the store, doing something else that wasn't driving to the store, but that's something that I don't know, especially with the new generation of listeners that are going to have to come to podcasting, that are TikTok people today or YouTube Shorts or Instagram Reels. How do you see that sort of upcoming generation that we're going to need to depend on as podcast listeners who haven't built the attention span to listen to what we think of as a podcast? Is that going to be a hard transition?
Well, I think it may, for some of us, it may be a hard transition. I think that you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned attention span. The good news is you can make a 3-minute long podcast if there's a market and an audience for that. And I think there is. In fact, my newer show, Legit Podcast Pro, is short form, 10-minute long episodes. That's still not, ultra brief, but if you can master the art of telling a story in under 3 minutes, there's something to be said for you're going to find your audience.
Yeah.
Especially as TikTok, well, I don't know. The court just today actually upheld the ban that requires TikTok to be divest its Chinese ownership.
Yeah.
So who knows if TikTok will still be here in a few months, but there will always be a replacement.
Right.
Anyway, so I think that the creators who embrace that short attention span can do a lot with it. Those of us who are entrenched in longer form content, there's always going to be a market for long form too. I mean, let's face it. I have an hour-long drive. I can't be scrolling on my phone to find what I look for. I want to listen to something that's going to get me there.
Right.
So I guess there's room for everybody. But some of us are going to be not finding our audience if they're looking for that short attention span stuff. And finding ways to hit the dopamine hit that you get with that short form stuff is something that we as podcaster creators really need to be thinking about. What can we do to get that adrenaline pumping a little bit with our audience, and doing it frequently? If you do have a long form show, keeping them listening is going to depend on giving them that little jolt every once in a while.
Sure.
I don't know exactly how we do that.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's how do you make a long form, going back to the movie industry, it's like there's got to be a beat every 3 pages or whatever it is, right? So
right.
It's some of it might just be people getting better at pacing.
The jump scare podcast. There we go.
Exactly. Yes. So that we have that let's just call them the young kids, that younger generation, that's been brought up on a different type of media consumption than pretty much any other generation. Something you and I were talking about off air before we started was that, there's a lot of now legal stuff around influencers.
Yeah.
And there have been some pretty hefty fines doled out, if I'm not mistaken, already, specifically, I think, around crypto stuff. But do those laws today apply to podcasters? Do podcasters know they apply to them?
I think yes to the first question and no to the second. Most podcasters, I don't think, are thinking very hard about it. I mean, a lot of podcasters have used affiliate advertising as one of their revenue models. And so they've been tuned into the fact that you have to do a disclosure. It has to be clear and conspicuous and make it clear to your audience that you're going to make some money if they follow this link or use this code. And that's basically the rule, is be transparent, don't deceive your audience. But when you're doing an endorsement, it doesn't always read as an endorsement. We don't hear that it's an endorsement. It's just, my friend, it's sort of very informal, very the host read kind of a thing sometimes comes off as really just conversation.
Yeah.
And so if you are making money, that's the rule. If you're making money, if there's a financial relationship, it needs to be disclosed as transparently as possible. And, you know, in the Instagram and TikTok world, that's the hashtag ad or hashtag paid, something like that.
Yeah. I
think we can be a little more nuanced in the approach in podcasting, but you need to be clear. Yeah, there's a relationship here, and you know, as customers, as consumers, I think we want to know when the people we trust are getting paid for what they're telling us to trust.
Right.
And that's really the bottom line. I think we're going to see, speaking of podcasting, I mean, she didn't make her fame as a podcaster, but we all know that, what's her name? Haley Welch, the Hawk Tuah girl, had a pretty spectacular explosion of her what's it called? Meme coin, Hawk coin.
For an hour or two.
Well, and we'll still be talking about it 5 years from now as the litigation continues.
Right.
And it would not surprise me to see the FTC get involved, at least to investigate what went on there and things like that. And you know, so when we were talking offline, you asked me, are podcasters influencers? And I said, I think at least some are.
Yeah.
And I think we all ought to think of ourselves in that way, because whether you've got 10 listeners or 10,000 listeners or 10 million, to those listeners, what you say matters. And I mean, unless they are only listening for the sheer enjoyment of taking you down a peg.
You know who you are out there.
Yeah, they are, you know, they're being influenced by what you tell them. So we need to think about following those rules.
As we were talking about this, I was trying to find the right parallel. Mm-hmm. There's product placement on TV all the time that doesn't need disclosures. Is there, or in movies, is there, aside from, you know, protecting the probably specifically the younger generation, aside from just general, it makes sense because a lot of people got ripped off as a reaction. Is it otherwise, in your mind, I want to use the word fair. I don't know if that's the right word, but is it fair that, you know, these independent people who've built this up, you know, have to go through this process? But if you're ABC, you can just do a product placement on a show and nobody needs to know about it.
You know, that's a great question. I'm not sure that product placement shouldn't be subject to these same rules. I mean, there are different kinds of product placement and integrate. You know, when the characters in the sitcom are drinking soda and they pull out and it's a can of Pepsi, and we sort of unconsciously note, oh, you know, that character drinks Pepsi. Is that really an endorsement, or do we need to know that Pepsi paid to be on that show instead of Coke or instead of a generic soda can? Mm-hmm. Does it matter? It's, you know, in the storytelling, maybe.
Right.
Also, I should say that, you know, that product placement, product integration thing is not as big a deal in the industry as it was 25, 30 years ago. You know, the classic is the E.T. with the Reese's Pieces instead of the M&Ms. And the little history there is that it was Reese's Pieces because M&Ms said no.
Right.
To the product placement deal. But yeah, I mean, I feel like it probably should be disclosed. So rather than saying, no, the rest of us shouldn't have to comply either, I think we should be looking at, well, wait a minute, there's these other practices that are just as dangerous or risky.
Yeah.
And I'm just not sure why it's never been scrutinized in the product placement world.
I have a couple of ideas.
Well, we can think about, power and balance.
I have a few 100 billion ideas maybe why, but.
Right.
To that end, is there a need for, or is there one? I might just be oblivious. Is there a need for, you know, some larger, you know, creatives representation to go, you know, sit in Congress and say, I'm here to represent all the podcasters, and this is what we think of X law?
I think that there is a need. Yeah, I think there's a need. I think there's certainly room in the conversation for that. The challenge is that the independents, the voice of those independents, first of all, is not a unified voice.
Sure.
And doesn't have they don't have the resources to fund that kind of lobbying. And maybe there's a trade group or something that can form. We've seen a few organizations try to get up and going to represent that independent podcaster movement.
Yeah.
And it hasn't met with a lot of success.
Because it's like everything's got the pros and the cons. It's like, one of the great things about podcasting is that there is no establishment. There is no this thing. The flip side is if there was, we'd all be part of the Screen Guild and we'd have all this representation. I heard you say it's needed. Is it going to happen? Like, is that something? Do you think there's enough parties could coalesce together where something would look like a powerful body?
I don't think that the touchstone issue that affects enough independent podcasters all in the same way and has a single response has happened yet. But I think it can.
Yeah.
Just don't know what it's going to be. I mean, honestly, if you want the one thing that I think that all podcasters could benefit from a single unified voice speaking for them is the music arena, is getting either getting the music industry to listen, that's not government, but getting the music industry to listen and say, hey, this podcasting thing's not going away. Let's find a way to let folks use music in their shows. And the music industry has just not been interested in hearing about it. There have been a few businesses that have tried to start up and do something, and it just sort of never really gains much momentum. So maybe lobbying Congress to get an exception or a compulsory mandatory licensing structure or something like that in place could be a thing. But once again, who's going to pay the lobbyists to make that happen?
Right. That's probably the biggest sticky issue still, right? Is licensing for podcasters.
Well, it's certainly the one that everybody's still, let's face it, we want to make shows that feel like the radio show or the television shows we've grown up with. And therefore, and frankly, that I can make a video on TikTok and use a piece of music. I have to pick it from a library, but I can do my video that way.
Yeah.
And you can't do that with podcasting. So it's on people's minds more often than anything else, I think.
Has anybody been successful that you're aware of in specific shows getting what they want in terms of licensing?
Well, anecdotally, I don't know this from personal experience, but my understanding is that when Dan Miller, may he rest in peace, when he was doing his show, what was it called, the 40-Hour Work Week, he wanted to get a piece of music. I'm trying to remember what song it was, but it was a famous song from the 70s or early 80s about money. And he approached them and he offered them $100 and they said, sure. And he used that song every year. It was $100 a year for the license. And, that's unheard of. I was going to say,
they must have had a very unique, they own their own masters. Universal wasn't doing their distribution. Like
who knows? Yeah, exactly. But I think it was Taking Care of Business was the song.
Okay.
If I remember correctly. Anyway, so, and it was a good fit and there was sort of no downside for the owners of the song. So,
sure.
Okay. And he was early enough in the game to ask the question and approach them before anybody had realized, oh, wait, maybe there's something, and I don't know that the industry has yet realized that there's maybe something here.
Yeah. And anecdotally, I come from a musical family, so I have a tiny bit of familiarity with it, but sure. Anecdotally, putting podcasts to the side, most artists would also probably say licensing is broken based on the amount of times the artist would agree to license the song and whoever controls the catalog says no.
Or set the price too high.
Or set the price. Yeah, that's not enough money or et cetera. So it's not necessarily just like everything's great except for podcasting totally when it comes to licensing. So there's that part of it too, which again, there's sort of like disruption happens when there's enough parties that are like, I actually don't like the way the current thing works.
Yeah, well, enough parties and enough power, and we know that power follows the money. So unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah. Other than that, is there any other sort of, you said that would be the one coalescing event or it was around that, but is there something else maybe on the defensive front? Like what would it take for people be trying to do to podcasting that you think could bind people together that you could foresee? Like, I think something that would take away the independence, I could see being something that would bring people together.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that would probably come in the form of some kind of regulation that puts uncomfortable, unreasonable restraints on what we as podcasters are able to do. Whether it's the FTC stuff getting stricter or whether it's some sort of more speech-oriented, free speech is a pretty solidly entrenched thing. But, as governments change, and we're about to deal with a big change in our government, there are different ideas about what should and shouldn't be allowed. What kind of things can we say or do on our shows? The pace of those kinds of changes tends to be slow enough moving that most of us don't notice until it's too late.
In my mind, I'm sort of seeing like Spotify starts playing ads while the podcast that you're listening to in the Spotify player is on, but they're technically just playing the RSS feed, and totally unrelated in between is when they're playing the ads, and like something like that, where you've got Spotify being the let's call it enemy in this scenario, people coming together and saying, well, hold on, Spotify, you can't just play ads in between my podcast and that person's podcast. We want to not let you use our copyrighted material, or
we want you to give us a share of the money,
or we want licensing or whatever. Right, exactly. And Spotify says, no, thanks. No. We're just the player. And that's how we're supporting our player. It has nothing to do with your show. If you have ads in your show, those get played too. It's something like that I could see, especially with how much action Spotify is getting, as being something that brings people together.
And Spotify is a really interesting study to look at because, let's face it, they have not been good to the music artists that are driving their business either. And for them to, same position, to say, well, no, it's really about the player. No, it's not.
Right.
Folks are coming because they want to hear Taylor Swift. They don't care if they're listening on Spotify or some other platform. It's just that Spotify is the one that's got it and it's easy.
Right.
So, okay, so the player makes it easy, but there's others out there. So they have generally not been kind to the creators, and they treat creators worse than raw materials.
And is that, I mean, there's some sense of like the record companies are terrible, and thank God that, they're no longer involved. And now we've got Spotify, which, oh my God, they're paying us what?
Yeah, well, the record companies are on that receiving end of that also, so they're finally getting a little taste of their own medicine.
Sure.
Maybe.
But this great newfound freedom of streaming, and there's, on the flip side, Taylor Swift can make $1 billion touring, so the Spotify revenue is probably okay.
Yeah, but the kid next door with the guitar who's got a couple of hit songs, not so much.
Right.
And this is true. This has been true of every new disruptive technology in history. When the nature of disruption is that it shakes things up for some folks who are comfortable with the way it works, and it improves things for some and puts other things in jeopardy. And the world keeps turning, and things change, but as we're talking about, I guess sort of some things stay the same.
Yeah.
Just different people experiencing it.
One of the things that I found really striking at Podcast Movement in DC in August was the range of what I have called emotions, but other people might call opinions, around AI and how it's going to affect podcasting.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a very wide spectrum, right? There was this is the greatest thing ever. It's going to, make it even easier to produce great content and to do more shows, and this is fantastic. On one hand, and then the very end of the other spectrum, it was like, this is terrible, and people, we should force people to use disclaimers if there's any AI involved in the production. And I just remember thinking like this, I'm so confused. I get this set of emotions, like it's just general excitement for new technology, and I would expect to feel that in podcasting. But the like doom and gloom and the angst and the all of that, it seemed really like out of character for our industry. How did you see that?
Similar perception of it, that the disparity of viewpoints was all over the place. And I have mixed feelings about it, to be honest. My own feelings are, I've been sort of a proponent of the disclaimer thing, at least when the content is mostly generated or all generated by AI. Mm-hmm. When there's a human person intervening and making, for example, I use an AI tool to help script some of my content. I don't feel like I have to tell my audience that, because I am still taking that and making it my own before I deliver it to camera and to microphone. Were I not involved in that and it was just some system sounding like my voice and worst case making people think it's actually me, yeah, I think there needs to be a disclosure there. But it's a tool and it has a lot of strong utility. It's a useful tool. So should we not use it? No. Should we maybe be transparent when we're using it? Yeah, within reason.
Yeah.
And as more and more people are using these tools, it becomes less critical to disclose it, because everybody's going to start assuming we're using these tools.
Right.
When Photoshop came out, photographers were terribly upset about it.
Sure.
Now who uses Photoshop? Photographers.
Yeah. Well, so, and my music industry example, right? Like the end of music was the invention of Pro Tools, right?
And auto-tune, right?
Yeah. It was like, but the end of music, like people aren't recording on tape anymore. It's all dead. There's no need for engineers. There's no need for artists, Pro Tools. There's just as many engineers working with just as many artists. They're just recording to Pro Tools now instead of tape.
And yet some of it is affordable enough that you and I can have it in our home system and use it to make some recordings or just noodling around with music or whatever we're doing. And so again, it's a valuable tool.
You said the quiet part out loud that nobody said to me on the disclaimer side, which is that it's because of the assumption that people would have. Because my counter has always been like, okay, like, does somebody need to put a disclaimer at the beginning of Seinfeld that like George Costanza doesn't really work for the Yankees? Like, I don't understand why I would, like, by the way, welcome to Star Wars. Just so you know, no droids were harmed. This was not actually shot in outer space. Like there's a suspension of disbelief that you have when you start watching a movie or a television show.
And actually, even though I say what I say about, I think there's some reason for some disclosures, I think maybe the real opportunity is on the flip side of this. And that's for those who are creating entirely human-generated material to make that their brand.
Right.
To have that sort of seal of approval.
News by humans.
Well, yeah. I mean, look for the union label, right?
Right.
And people can say, when you get my show, you're getting the real me.
Mm.
And maybe that will attract audiences. Maybe that'll be a sign of, where we draw these lines.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So talk about, you said you use AI to help you script the shows. Is there any other, like, if you don't mind, what's your process for that? Like, what do you use? What do you like?
So I usually decide on what the topic of the episode is going to be based on my understanding of what's going on in the industry and what people are asked, questions that are being asked of me. And I will then say, give me an outline of the top 5 points or 10 points that I need to cover if I'm going to do this. And it's really just a time-saving tool. If I sat down and did it myself, I'd probably come up with the same thing.
Yep.
Every once in a while, I get something that's like, oh, that's interesting. And more often it's, oh, that's totally not relevant. And then so I'll refine that outline, and then maybe I'll feed it back into a GPT or a Claude or something like that. And I'll say, okay, give me talking points on number 3.
Mm.
And more about just making sure I don't miss anything than, and if I'm really short on time, I'll say, okay, write the script. And then I have to rewrite the script, so it doesn't really save me a lot of time. It's gotten better. I was able to train it by giving it a bunch of my episodes initially, and it's gotten pretty good at capturing my voice, I would say. But it's still, I don't use the word essential in every other sentence the way the system wants me to. So, and oftentimes it's just from the talking points I can deliver straight to camera. And then I do use it to create the description for YouTube and the show notes, again, for the podcast, and sometimes the captioning for Instagram and those kinds of things. And I use I experiment with lots of tools, but I always come back to ChatGPT, and Cast Magic is one of my favorites for What's interesting is Cast is more after you've created the content. It goes through, transcribes, and creates summaries and other stuff. So I'm using it more on the front end to generate the stuff I'm going to use to deliver content.
Yeah, I don't use it for the show, but one of the things I have noticed that and maybe it's my personality, you can tell me if you see it the same way or not. Sometimes it's so hard for me to get the bat off my shoulders to start even writing an email or something. But when my EA writes drafts in my drafts folder, and I go, oh, that's terrible. I need to change that. And I'm right into it. Right. I'm like an email that I would have put off writing or maybe not written. Right. Now I'm like, well, I wouldn't say that. I'd say this. And
so you don't know what to say, but you also do know what not to say.
Correct. Yes. Like, well, there's this human
inertia.
But the one, it's like the one human trait that spans across all cultures and languages is the desire to correct somebody.
Yeah.
And so like I use it with my 2-year-old, like, that's a square. No, it's a circle. Oh, okay, sorry. And then you can use this, like, write this email. No, that's not what I'd say. Out of my way. I don't want to write this email. Oh my God, what are you typing? Out of my way. So like, there's some value, I think, in that, even for creatives, to just editing what ChatGPT started. You might end up in a place where not a single word is what originally started there, but you'd be sitting there putting it off still if you had to write the first sentence.
Agreed. Yeah, it can be good for ideation and initiation. It isn't a finishing tool.
No.
I would say. Yeah, I mean, look, we had 2 major entertainment industry strikes last year that were largely over this question of, should the industry use these tools? Should the film industry be allowed to use AI tools in place of writers? And should they be allowed to create synthetic versions of actors to perform scenes? And sometimes the actors are saying, well, yeah, I don't want to jump off that building.
I don't want to die. Let's leave that for Tom Cruise.
And sometimes they're saying, well, no, but I should get paid as though I was there on set that day. And so that's sort of where the union landed on that one.
Yeah.
Writers get to decide whether they use AI. The studio doesn't get to tell them to. And those kinds of things. And I think they've landed on a reasonable middle ground where, again, it's a tool. We can use it if we need it, but don't force us into that box.
And do you see it starting to fade into the background as it becomes just more of a recognized tool, like in the same way that, like, the examples we talked about, nobody today is disclaiming that the record was made on Pro Tools and not analog.
Right.
Like, are we going to get to the point where, of course, I don't care if you use it. Maybe you're using, maybe not. Everybody does. Who cares?
I would say eventually we may get there. I think it's a long way off if it is. And largely that's just because we've got a long way to go till the legal issues around AI are settled. There's a lot of copyright suits going on right now.
Yeah.
And I mean, I do worry when it's possible to give a prompt to an AI that gives you an output that's almost identical to an article that appeared in the New York Times. That's not good. And we, as creators, we shouldn't like the notion of that happening, even though, again, it's a valuable tool. But yeah, eventually when we can trust these tools more, and we know what the boundaries are, yes, I think we'll start to see acceptance that it's just the way we do things.
Yeah. And
but we're ways off.
How do you see the copyright specifically implications around the AI generated content today?
It's really tricky, and there's a lot of minds that are smarter than I am about this thinking about it. But there's a couple of different sides to it. One is the copyright in the material that was used to train these tools, which is essentially basically everything that's available on the internet. Well, if I wrote something and someone asks the question and they should have found me to get the answer, it just cost me an opportunity or a client or something like that. So I'm worried that, especially if the output is too similar to what I came up with. And frankly, the system wouldn't have been able to generate that output without my stuff, even if it isn't similar. So that's what the copyright holders are claiming about the ingestion side of it.
Yeah.
Then there's the side where if the output is too similar to the work I created, who do you point fingers at? And, who's the infringer? It's a computer somewhere that theoretically compiled a bunch of information. But that sentence, that came from me. That paragraph, that came from me. That's another kind of copyright infringement of the distribution of a copy. And then there's the third angle on this, and that's the other side of this, is that the output of these machines, where there's no human involved in making the content, can anybody own that content, that output?
Right.
In all but a couple of countries around the world, the copyright authorities have basically said no. So it's another reason not to over-rely on these tools, right? Because if you can't own what you've spent that time prompting and tweaking and polishing, well, now you've got some intellectual property that's yours and some that isn't.
Right.
And that's not so good.
And is there a parallel to that? Like I'm let's take the dumbest scenario I can think of while you were talking, which is like you potentially don't own the copyright to your own show notes.
Right.
If ChatGPT or if a language model prepared your show notes for you.
Yeah, that's true.
Is there a parallel to that? Like you could, I can't think of anything that would be as absurd, like short of, I hire an intern to do my show notes, and in the intern's contract, I granted that I would give the intern the copyright for any content they produced while writing my show notes for me.
What's interesting is that actually I'm going to flip that one on its side, because the truth is, if you don't have the right language in your contract with the intern, and the intern isn't an employee, they actually do own the material they create, which is one of the things as a lawyer I'm always telling creators is make sure everybody has that work made for hire clause in the contract.
Right.
And that's true of your guests on the show too. They're helping you co-create this content. Do I co-own this episode of your show?
Whatever you think the right answer is, yes.
Well, I don't want to claim co-ownership of it, so you
I'll
can
sign whatever you put in front. I'll sign whatever you put in front of me.
Right. Well, and that's actually one of my sort of evangelical missions, if you will, is to get hosts to use a guest release when they have people come on their show.
Yep.
And I make it available for free. If anybody's interested, go to podcastrelease.com and give me your email address. I'll send you a release.
Yeah.
But the analog to what you're talking about, I'll put it this way. This is not a new thing saying that if it's not human authorship, it's not something you can own. A few years ago, maybe a decade ago, there was the case involving the monkey selfie, where this photographer went to some, game preserve in, I want to say Borneo or something like that, where there's this band of, I think they're called scarlet-crested macaque. They're a particular primate, and they're really smart. And they, from having seen enough tourists taking selfies, when this photographer realized what he could do, he took the camera, set it on automatic, put it down on a log, and walked away. And when he came back, there was the camera, and the monkeys had been taking selfies. And if you look up monkey selfie on Google, you'll see pictures of this monkey named Naruto.
Yeah.
And when Wikipedia tried to post one of these images for an illustration of that monkey, the photographer sued saying, wait a minute, that's mine. And the courts said, no, you don't. No, it's not.
Huh.
And the monkey can't own it because it's not a person. So there's that. And even that wasn't the first time this has come up, because there was cases involving the elephant, where someone would hand the elephant a paintbrush and the elephant would make a painting. And then they claimed ownership, and it was not owned by the owner.
Yeah.
So this is not new. It's everything old is new again in its way. And
I did not have monkey selfie on my bingo card, but that was amazing. I now have to go look this up.
It's one of the fun ones. It's why entertainment law is fun.
Yeah, that's like the greatest. I mean, first of all, I want to hear from the photographer. Like, what were you expecting when you gave the monkeys?
It was a weird lawsuit too, because he sued Wikimedia Foundation, and then PETA, the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, came in and claimed that no, there should be a trust set up for the animals. And I mean, it just went on for 5 years or something like this before the courts finally said, all of you go away.
And as always, the lawyers did just fine.
Lawyers came out great.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to land it. I mean, I do want to end on monkey selfie, but I don't want to end on, and the lawyers came out great. So, give me your prediction for 5 years from now, let's say. We're in 2030. What does what are the biggest striking differences that you would predict today about how the podcasting industry looks 5 years from now compared to today?
Well, I think podcasting is already overtaking what we now think of as mainstream media in terms of the attention that it gets from audiences. And I think that's only going to increase. People are going looking for the content they want, and they don't care about all the other stuff. And so nonlinear consumption of media is definitely on a continuing upward trend. I think that means that smart brands are going to put more money into advertising on those platforms, certainly with the big shows. I think it presents great opportunities for smaller niche shows to find ways to monetize that don't necessarily involve advertising. Mm-hmm. Let's face it, the 1,000 true fans principle is there. If you've got 1,000 people listening and they're willing to give you $100 a year, everybody $100,000, that's nothing to sneeze at. So I think there's opportunity there. From a legal standpoint, I think we're gonna see more disputes between co-creators as relationships start to make their way to the end of the relationships. Mm-hmm. Who owns this thing?
It's tough to keep a band together.
Right, exactly. So yeah. I talk about the need for having a podcast prenup when you're starting, so that when it's ending, everybody knows what they get and what they're supposed to do and how the buyouts work if somebody's going to continue the show, things like that. I think that's going to increase, and I think we're going to see probably more consolidation of the platform side of things. There's going to, I think Spotify's here to stay. I think Amazon's here to stay. I think some of the smaller podcast-centric networks are going to merge and combine and be bought up and those kind of things. That's really a continuing trend. And I think more of the public is going to be treating podcasting as normal media, which is a big change from where we were even 10 years ago, when people would still say, what's a podcast?
Right. Yeah, like the one thing that sticks out in my mind is I always tell people is like, my mom has never called me to tell me she successfully tuned the radio, but she will call me to tell me she successfully downloaded somebody's podcast. So like there's still a tiny bit of a technical hurdle for
setting the clock on the VCR.
Oh, my stove is still blinking at home. I don't even need a VCR to have blinking right. Clocks. Gordon, this was amazing. Thank you so much for your time. I think.
Well, I've had a great time talking with you, man.
Everybody, I certainly learned a lot. I'm definitely going to go Google monkey selfie now. I'm not going to look it up on Urban Dictionary, but I'm definitely going to Google it. Gordon, it was amazing. Thank you for your time. We'll have all the links in the show notes. Everybody should absolutely get the book because we're all ill-equipped to deal with the stuff that's happening.
Well, get the book, get that release if you have guests, podcast release, and, follow me on socials and on YouTube. I've got my Legit Podcast Pro is a YouTube and podcast show. I would love it if folks would listen there, and if I can be of any help, GordonFiremark.com is how you find me. So
amazing,
Matt. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Cheers.
Another round, so much more to talk about. Gonna aim to satisfy with help from CacheFly. Get to it fast. Right here on the Anycast. Make it strong, make it last. Right here on the Anycast. The Anycast podcast, brought to you by CacheFly.